Welcome to what would have been the final session of Quakerism 101. We ended up moving the fifth session to a date that will be decided. This was to be our last session. It's covering the last two chapters of the Quaker Way. And joining us to lead this session is Jim Kuhn. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, James. Good to see you, Prakash and Lulu. I really appreciated the opportunity not just to read Rex Ambler's book, but also to revisit the Quakerism 101s of the past. So there is from about a year ago, a Quakerism 101 on witness and social concerns on the website, which I recommend viewing because we watched a video by Nadine Hoover, a Quaker who was very inspiring, and heard from a bunch of members of the Quaker meeting here in Austin, and talked a lot about organizations that are involved in support for social justice and from a Quaker perspective, as well as some of the activities of this meeting in these kinds of questions and concerns. So what I'd like to do is something a little different than that, because that's online. And rather than repeat that, I want to take as a guide to our discussion some of the excerpts from Rex Ambler's book that spoke to me. And so what I'd like to do is I will read a couple passages and we'll pause and consider what they mean for us individually. But I'll also share some quotes from other members of the Friends Meeting of Austin who said things last year in our Zoom Quakerism 101 that really resonated with me. And so I would like to, kind of amplify those voices and echo them back a little bit. And along the way, one of the questions that I think is worth kind of using as a framing query is how do we as individuals know when we feel led to make a change in the world, and it's what you might call a true leading, rather than something which, in the Quaker term, hasn't maybe been seasoned enough, or hasn't been tested with regard to faith and Quaker practice. These are some of the questions that came up last year that I really appreciate because, of course, we're all led to work in the world and make changes for the better. And sometimes that's hard. It's always hard, but it's often harder than it could be otherwise, than if these leadings were tested. The other thing which I'm going to do, and this may seem a little counterintuitive, but I'm going to start with the last chapter, and then we'll end with the next to last chapter. And partly that's because I want us to leave thinking about the testimonies with the idea that if we leave with the testimonies in mind, it'll get us into a better frame for making change in the world as we go about our daily lives. Right, so I'm just going to read a couple of passages from the chapter called Changing Things. And I like the way Rex frames this, because he frames it in terms of feeling, in terms of understanding, in terms of faith and action. So feeling, understanding, faith, and action. And I'm gonna start with just a reading from Faith.
That was just Howard saying hi, by the way. He just wanted to come and say he has to head out, but he wants to say hello.
Thanks, Howard.
Sure.
So just a couple lines. And love, in the spiritual sense, is what inspires and motivates us to help other people. It is a quite natural response, a prompting of love and truth in our hearts. If others are in pain, we feel in pain too. Others are in need, we want to help. None of this is adequate, of course, for dealing with the complex situations we all get into, but it is a start. And for us Quakers, it is the start. And the thing that this leads me to reflect is that maybe as close to a creed or a doctrine as we can get in Quakerism, or particularly as it relates to social justice and making change in the world. It starts from love. Under circumstances, as in Quakerism, where we don't have an established creed or doctrine that we all agree that we believe in collectively, this, however, is one that is sort of foundational. Steve Dock, at last year's Quakerism 101 on witness and social practice, said something which resonated with me, which is, he said, each person has to find their own way, led by the Spirit within us. And this should test what we are called to do with Spirit-led people, to make sure it isn't just an ego trip. And so that's one of the reasons that I feel it's important to consider actions and social justice change in the world that we might be led to do as individuals, testing it against these kind of first principles, but also with other Spirit-led people. And Rex goes on to say that kind of on the flip side of the love equation, he says, we do not seek to change things out of anger or pride or a desire to prove ourselves right or worthy. These are very common motivations for change, which we must all be familiar with, but they lead to quite different results. And so, going back to this initial question, how do we know that the leadings that we feel moved to make some change in the world are true leadings? And these are two kinds of methods in my mind of doing that. One is it sourced from this sense of love, and the other is has it been tested in community? Hello. And so from feeling to understanding is a step that Rex unpacks. But before I kind of get into another reading on from the Quaker way, I'd like to just pause and think and see what folks think about these two questions. Are our calls for action in the world led by love? And if so, how have we tested them with what Steve Dock refers to as Spirit-led people? And what would testing them, in fact, look like? I have my own answers to these questions, but I wonder also if others have thoughts about feeling.
I think that's a great question for right now, especially. I just reading news online, or especially if I ever go to social media, I just get so angry and afraid all the time looking at stuff. And it just, I feel very reactive and like I have to do something and like everything's gonna fall apart. And I just have to like, and I definitely feel like that's not what, it's tricky though, since partially that does come from a place of love. Like there are so many things and people that I care about and that I'm worried about. But how to really, how to test myself. And I think that sort of practice of pausing a little bit and trying to see, I love that, what that sort of, the first motion is love. That's really a profound thing. And I'm not sure I'm great at practicing that all the time, but I think that's really
I can relate.
profound. Yeah, that's to try not to, to just be so reactive, since there's just so much to react to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think it was St. Augustine. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think it was St. Augustine or somebody that said, you know, the initial reaction is anger, but you have to have the courage to change that anger into compassion or love. You have to have the courage, because, you know, if you see something where there's injustice or something is just not fair, the initial reaction may be anger. And I'm not so sure, unless that anger translates to violence, I'm not convinced that anger is entirely wrong all the time. I think you have to have that initially, and then it has to transform. Some people say compassion, some people say love. I think it stems from the same place.
I think another word that's often used is passionate as well. You got to be passionate about it.
Yeah, I like that because anger can be something that is a motivating force for good if it's transformed, as you say. I also really relate to feeling fearful, frustrated, angry, upset, helpless. These are it's part of the human condition, and in particular when you see injustices going on in the world, and we feel powerless to affect positive change. I'll just share that I moved to Texas shortly before the 2016 presidential election, and started coming to the Friends Meeting of Austin. And what I discovered was in doing that was how important the silent meditation was for me to cope with my own feelings about that election and about the suffering that I just sort of felt viscerally was about to happen, and did in so many ways. But I feel that there was a little bit of that kind of transformation that Prakash, that you're talking about. And another, I'll quote from Larry Kelly Mahaffey, who leads Friends Committee on National Legislation delegations to meet with political leaders here in Austin. And I wouldn't have the patience. You know, what they're doing, what our friends are doing, are talking to people that we disagree with, and trying to convince them to make policy changes. But one thing that Larry said is that he leaves these meetings feeling oxygenated, feeling like uplifted, feeling like he's made a connection, even in cases where it's unlikely to affect real positive change. And he said a year ago in this Quakerism 101, he said, worship leads to action. Action doesn't lead to worship. That speaks to me. I hope that's right. I want that to be right. And it's the sort of truth that I think we all have an opportunity to enact and make real.
I think that the example that was used in the book, there was the English version of Dorothea Dix. Her name, I think, was Elizabeth Fry. I can't remember, but she was like a prison reformer.
Yeah.
So when she walked through the prisons, I guess that was in the 19th century in England, maybe, or maybe even sooner. Something must have angered or something must have been unsettling for her to see the way women and men were treated in the prison, because she came from a banking family, like a rich family, so she didn't need to care. But something was very deep. She saw things that were deeply unsettling that may have angered her, but she transformed that maybe. Action.
Yeah, it's a powerful story of Elizabeth Fry in Newgate Prison in 1813. I'd like to read a short quote relating to understanding, which is this sort of the step after feeling. Let's see. So he's talking about discernment and the kind of practice that we engage in, where we seek to understand whether this feeling is something that we really need to act on. And he says, that discernment is the sense of what is really going on that answers what we felt initially to be in need of help or other intervention, as the discernment is formulated in words to be shared among all concerned. It'll be checked by those concerned and then tested in experience as the understanding is put into practice. Since there is no ideology here, no official doctrine, the understanding can be changed in light of new experience, a new turn of events, and the action altered accordingly. It is a fluid, flexible, and responsive process, enabling everyone involved to respond consciously to the situation as they perceive it. It exemplifies that fundamental commitment in the Quaker way that truth, as each can know it for themselves, is what ultimately enables us to live freely and fully. So part of what is going on here is a description of a process whereby we bring our concerns to each other, and we raise questions about what we should be doing individually, collectively, and the process of discernment is, well, it's partially within, but it's also communal. It has to be something that we share with each other, and this is where that fact that so early on, there's a chapter here that uses the word experimentation, and so part of what has always drawn me to Quakerism is this idea that we test our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, our leadings to action against personal experience, against the small, quiet voice within, and then with each other as well. And something about that can lead to powerful change, powerful collective change in ways that are sometimes really big deals, sometimes little things, but the process of discernment. I mean, it's a little contradictory and kind of hard to understand because there's no ideology here, no official doctrine, but we are in fact after truth, and it can't be a truth that's like, well, true just for me, but not for you, except that it can in a way, because each of us has to, as Steve Dock said, each of us has to find our own way, led by the Spirit within us. And so we're all led sometimes in very different directions, but we arrive at the same place. Anyway, so I'm speaking in metaphors, but sometimes that's the only way to kind of sneak around what's actually going on. I like that this section is called understanding, because it's both a noun and a verb. Well, so I think of it more as a verb, and I think he's describing it that way. So we don't necessarily arrive at a settled conclusion. We test it out, things change, we adapt.
I feel like part of one way I sort of reconcile that seeming contradiction between it being sort of an individual truth that one's finding and that sort of collective dimension that this is the truth, sort of more like capital T truth that we're sort of working on together. Just that sort of part of that big T truth is truths about each of us that are personal and that are just true to ourselves. And it might be true that something could be really good and valuable and worthwhile in the world, but still not be a good idea for a person to do or to take on, that they might, for whatever personal reasons, that just might be bad for them, or it might be not the right time. And to try to bring the big picture, like this is a good thing in the world, and also the other part of the picture is who is this? Who's this person, and what is that's going to be right in that particular life? I think that's how I sort of try to bring those two together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the author cautions us to avoid knee-jerk reactions to want to help people. I think he uses several examples of this where, I don't know, somebody wanted help, a kid was knocking on a door and he needed help reaching the door to knock on it. It turned out a priest was walking by and knocked on the door for him because the priest could reach the door, and it turned out it was a prank that the kid was playing. So I think the author says, yeah, we all want to help and do good, but as Quakers, we have to understand the motivations, why we're doing what we're doing. How is our help going to do more harm than good? So be mindful and thoughtful of that, I think is what he was saying.
Yeah, that's a big one, particularly in areas of acting for change that we want to see in the world. Because the other thing that Steve Dock said that I quoted is, you want to make sure it's not a big ego trip. And so, I mean, there's a lot of, I think, if you've been to a protest, joined a march, been involved in social activism, You can see a lot of folks who are maybe involved for reasons other than making positive change in the world. I mean, people get involved in things for all different kinds of reasons. And I'm not here to judge anyone. What I do want to do is bring those questions to myself and kind of interrogate my own motivations. And it's part of that discernment process, because we don't want to get caught up in a big ego trip, and we don't. I mean, it's really interesting to me that there's a chapter in here on bearing witness, which is important, but he makes the point that we're not proselytizing here. This is not a faith that leads through conversion to a doctrine or creed. So it takes some extra effort to consider, what's the right path forward, and also will I start marching off and look around me and see I'm the only one doing it. And so these kinds of questions around individual and collective action come up in all of this. And one of the things that the Quakerism brings is community to these activities. Liz Yates at last year's Quakerism 101 on bearing witness and social justice talked about the support that we can give to each other as part of this community in our own activities, whether we're called to them or not. And the example that she used was the death penalty action, which a lot of folks from Friends Meeting of Austin feel called to do. Liz does not, but she provides support for those who do. She wrote about it for Friends Journal. And so part of the discernment practice that we want to do together is not just, it's not just me centered. It's not like, well, I've got this idea. Is this a good idea or not? Let me check with others. It's like about listening and supporting the work that others do that they feel true leadings towards. So there's some reciprocity involved in all this. The last two bits are faith and action, but before we move on to faith, anyone have any thoughts about understanding? I don't feel like I have a full understanding of the understanding section, but I was glad to read it.
See, I don't remember what section is which, but do you recall reading a section in there about poverty, and then the social scientists, economists, and so on said that, yeah, poverty is caused by, policies and the capitalist system. Something like that was written in the book. And then the author goes on to say, but that's where the social sciences stop, because it's based on some kind of ideology. But as Quakers, we have to imagine a different economic system altogether. And that was a line that had me thinking. I was like, do you have to be a Quaker to reimagine another system? I mean, there have been many other systems imagined by people of various persuasions. Whether it be cooperatives, worker cooperatives, or communes, or God forbid, some kind of forced communism. These people of all kinds of backgrounds, religious and otherwise, have dreamt up all kinds of alternatives, some far worse than capitalism, some better. So I'm not sure what he meant by that, but it had me thinking. I forgot what section that was in though. So if I'm all over the place, just forget it.
No, you're good. You're reminding me of this morning's forum where I came in late, but the microloans that are given out by Noah's Ark and the micro gifts in Bogota. I think all you have to do is ask for them. Is that right?
Yes, microfinancing in the Grameen Bank was started by one of the Bangladeshi economists, and he won a Nobel Prize for it. Yeah, Grameen Bank. Yeah. Similar concept.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's something. I mean, that's something I always wrestle with. That sort of starting from a place of love versus, and I don't know if it should be versus, but these sort of huge systemic sort of thoughts that just sort of like, they make the sort of smaller actions that I feel like I can take, or that are actually within my scope of power and my ability to do from a good place, seem like tiny or inconsequential, or maybe even counterproductive if they're somehow propping up the system by like making things just a little bit better for somebody. I'm not sure I've come to a good reconciliation between, I guess personally, I've just grown to become more skeptical of those sort of hugely broad stroke systemic critiques. That I think there's, my sense is that they tend to oversimplify something. That's still something I wrestle with, and I'm never entirely sure about.
Yeah, one of the things that Walter Long said was that our kind of natural state is to cooperate with each other and work together, and that maybe now we're getting into a little bit of the issues related to faith, but it could be that things are no more broken now than they've always been. But this is where I like to think about a Jewish concept. We raised our son in a Reform synagogue, and he was bar mitzvahed, and I went to a lot of his classes, and always appreciated a concept called tikkun olam, which is repair of the world. And in other Jewish faith traditions, they talk about the world constantly coming into creation in collaboration between God and people. Other Jewish faith traditions say that the Messiah won't come until we pave the way with good deeds. These are various ways that people talk about motivation for, explanation for the recognition that the world is in need of repair, and we are called upon to do it. And so, yeah, I think back to Walter's thought that, in fact, we all work together naturally. It's our natural state of affairs to do this, and what we, in terms of systems, maybe we ought to be trying to amplify that in ourselves and each other. Anyway. There's this great quote in the faith section from Václav Havel from Czechoslovakia. And it's a very secular quote to include in the faith area, but I like it a lot. He says, how does the power of truth operate? Under the orderly surface of the life of lies, there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, of its hidden openness to truth. The effective range of this special power of truth cannot be measured in terms of disciples, voters, or soldiers, because it lies spread out in the fifth column of social consciousness, in the hidden aims of life, in human beings' repressed longing for dignity and fundamental rights, for the realization of their real social and political interests. And I mean, this is, like I said, this is a really secular way of referring to what I think he's getting at is spirituality and the kind of spiritual network that knits us all together in ways that are hard to articulate, but which are perhaps paradoxically present in the silence of Quaker worship, as well as the actions of Quakers working together in the world. I like how he refers to a hidden openness to truth. And this is why I really appreciated hearing Larry Kelly Mahaffey describe his experience of coming away from talking to Roger Williams or some lunatic in the state government, saying he felt oxygenated and uplifted because you know, maybe there is a hidden openness to truth, and we just need to seek it. Anyway.
It reminds me a lot of the parables about the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
Sort of the leaven of bread and something that's sort of hidden and yet there, and yet has this sort of quiet power that's coming into the world.
Yeah. The faith section was another one that I didn't really feel like I fully understood, although the Havel quote just hit me. But you know, one of the points that seems that Rex Ambler makes over and over again throughout the book is that there is a faith associated with Quakerism. It's not the traditional faith of a doctrine or a creed, and so it's a little harder to put into words, to be sure that we share with each other, to be, you know, the sort of thing that is easy to explain to someone who wants to learn more about Quakerism. But yeah. The realization of our real social and political interests. This gets back to this kind of question of systemic problems that you're referring to, and how do we change them? And the one of the reasons to come together in community is because together we can do more than we can individually. But not just that, but it also provides for new opportunities to query oneself about one's own aims and actions. So this all feels a little bit abstract, and yet I feel like a kind of an introspective look at questions related to working for social justice feels right after a very informative Quakerism 101 on this topic last year, where we talked about FCNL, we talked about AFSC, we talked about Austin 10 Circa, we talked about Earth Care Witness, and we talked about some of the activities of this meeting in terms of the dating back to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, support for the rights of migrants, the work of this meeting over many decades in support of those on death row, and so yeah, go look at that video.
It might be helpful just in case people aren't able to go back and look at that to do a quick maybe explanation of what some of these organizations
of the landscape
are. Yeah,
sure.
the landscape of this.
Yeah. So there is an active organization called Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a lobbying group, and we've got members of the Friends Committee of Austin who regularly work with the national office to visit representatives here in Austin, or their offices. It was founded sometime around the Second World War. Has an office right across the street from the Senate, with an honor the treaties stone right in their front yard. It's a great location, but the Friends Committee on National Legislation is an interesting organization because it's led by the Quaker meetings around the country. They, on an annual basis, come to meetings for worship and say, what should we be focusing on this year? And so there was a forum maybe 6 weeks ago,
Something like that, yeah.
Where we discussed some of the ways in which the National Friends Committee on National Legislation should be lobbying our representatives in Congress. And Larry is a great person to be leading this on our behalf locally. And sooner or later, I'm gonna join him on one of these delegations. I'm mostly gonna sit and keep my mouth shut, but I want to see how it's done. And I'd encourage you all to talk to Larry to learn more about or go to fcnl.org. There's also the American Friends Service Committee, which has been around since 1917. Started as to help, I think, with war, pacifist organization against the First World War. But American Friends Service Committee is has done an awful lot in Palestine, dating back to the 40s, if not before. And the organization they had regional offices around the country that had to be closed during the crash, one of the market crashes, and so there aren't as many local offices as there were before. It's now New York and DC, I think. But one thing to mention is that Austin Town Circa de la Frontera grew out of the Austin office of the AFSC. So Austin AFSC sort of became Austin 10 Circa. Austin 10 Circa works with the maquiladoras, the kind of sweatshop labor factories just across the border in Mexico that were created as a result of NAFTA, and we were just hearing today about the poverty wages that are made by those who work in these sweatshops building products that we use every day. But American Friends Service Committee is, as the name suggests, about service to social causes internationally. AFSC.org.
The Austin 10 Circa, if you're here at the meeting house, they're in the little building that is just sort of up the hill from Friends Meeting of Austin. That's on Friends Meeting of Austin's property. They have used that space for many years since they've existed, I think.
Yeah.
And if you're ever curious, they do, I don't know if you mentioned, they do delegations to visit the maquiladoras and to build community with people in northern Mexico. So those are things that are available if you're interested in going on those.
Earth Care Witness is another organization, environmentally oriented organization that we've got a member of the Friends Meeting of Austin who's very actively involved, Andrea Bean, member of the Peace and Social Concerns Committee, and she has felt called to engage in direct actions opposing the pipelines that have been built, not just in the northern part of the country, but also here in Texas, and seeking to shut down pipelines that go through native lands as well as, under rivers, through fairly pristine forest land, and the risks associated with spills are very dire. So she's been active on her own in traveling to, I think, did she go to Montana?
She did, and most recently down to Corpus Christi
And
area.
Corpus Christi, that's right. Yeah.
Mhm.
But she's also been active in the Earth Care Witness organization, and so is kind of acting both in direct action as an individual, but also helping with the organization. So those are some of the organizations that help lead us from faith to action, and so I'd like to read a quote from, I guess it's the last page of the chapter about action. So once again, we notice how close these two concerns are: to communicate the truth and to help relieve suffering. The most effective way of our communicating the truth that is of most concern to us is to live it out in our lives. Our lives become our testimony. We now see that in seeking to relieve suffering, the most effective means we have is to convey the truth of the situation that causes suffering. So there's a lot of suffering in the world. We've got to do something about it. But I'll just read something that Liz Yates said, which I think I may have summarized earlier, but she said, witness can look like a single individual out there acting in the world, but what Quakers bring to this is community and an institutional and spiritual framework for collective action, as well as a ground for testing one's truth, as well as a mechanism for supporting others. And so these are what I like to think of as effective tools for helping to relieve suffering, as well as for testing one's own ideas about whether or not it's even a good idea to begin with. And supporting others who are moved to action.
I have a question just for you and actually for anybody. So have you had the experience of having a leading that you've stepped back from, or that you've realized is not right for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. There have been situations like that in the Peace and Social Concerns Committee, where, and in fact, it's if you look at the Peace and Social Concerns Committee's the description of the committee, one of the goals of the committee is to provide a venue for friends to test their own leadings around questions of peace and social concerns. And I think I need to think about that for a minute. I mean, there have been things that we've been led to do that haven't worked out. The stars just haven't aligned. I'll give you one example. Chip, maybe you've got others. But I'm thinking of we went through a process of discernment, of discussion, of bringing to meeting the possibility of using our kitchen for preparation of food for the unhoused. Before the city passed that terrible proposition and they started clearing the camps, there were some unhoused people who were distributing food on a daily basis. And the question was, could they prepare some of that in our kitchen? And after a series of conversations about things like insurance and other questions, we decided, yes, actually, we want to do this. Mm-hmm. And it just ended up not happening, largely because the camps were cleared. And so, a way for people to easily distribute food was no longer possible. People had gone into the woods. Mm. So sometimes the leadings come at the wrong time, or the stars don't align.
I feel like I just, sorry, answer my own question. In terms of broad social move, I haven't really, thankfully, been a part of anything I regret too much. Some organizations I've been part of have been done things that are a little questionable at times. That like very involved with local democratic politics and also with Occupy, and just there's just so much chaos in the world. I guess more where this comes in is more my kind of like where I feel this great sense of righteousness and I'm going to do something in an organization or in an interpersonal setting, and I just am like fully set on side. I feel like that process of discernment is very helpful in those sort of contexts. I sometimes find myself kind of on a warpath with some organization, and I just kind of need to take a little step back and just be like, okay, we're not gonna just see if this is maybe not coming from a place of love, and we should maybe talk to some other people first before we do this. So that's been my experience.
James, I could give a personal example of a leading that I felt very strongly about, and now I feel after discernment and maybe a year or more feel a little differently about. And Jim, you and I were talking about that today. Since the first time I visited Georgetown, Texas, which is fairly close to where I live, and that would have probably been 2018. And I became aware of a Confederate statue that stands there. I really have been working to try to get it removed. And there were some really good high points in that too. We got Southwestern University involved at one point. There was one point that we had 30 or 40, 50 students out there, which was pretty nice. And maybe part of it is because of how societally we've shifted since George Floyd's murder, and almost gotten back into some form of complacency. But the effort to remove the statue still exists. But what it feels like now, it's more about the statue rather than the concept of equality and equity and what that statue does to others. So in other words, it turns often into a shouting match between those who want it down and those who want it to remain. And that doesn't feel like it's coming from a position of love to me. So I've kind of backed away. I'm still very much in belief that it's a symbol that needs to be removed, but yet that particular method doesn't align with me anymore. And I think that, I'm sorry to have joined late. I had to come home and let the dogs out. But I think that maybe goes along with what you're talking about, that sometimes you can get a leading, but, I guess I'll say leadings they're not like rebar cast in concrete. Your leadings can change over time.
Great question and great example. Yeah. Should we take a few minutes break?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And then we'll finish up by talking a little bit about the leadings, the testimonies described in Bearing Witness.
Oh, so maybe how many minutes do you think? Probably like 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Very similar. Mine unfortunately also has some sharp things in it, sort of line forks. You're welcome. That's the case. That's got things like that. So push it into a line fork.
Yeah, this is pretty good. Like leather happens.
Yeah, the hole's good.
Finally learned after pencils poking.
Yeah.
Hurts. I think it's in the library. Yeah.
Another Quakerism 101 drawing to a close, but we have one more.
One more. Yeah, we still need to figure out when that one's going to be, but that's yeah.
And I look forward to reviewing the others on.
Yeah, I think it's been a really good, interesting year. Yeah, definitely different feel, I feel like, from last.
Mhm.
Which, I mean, I guess this is with the hybrid model for one
Yeah.
thing. It's very, different sort of dynamic. Yeah, it's good though. It's so neat that we have this sort of archive.
Right. Yeah.
Now, so
It's nice. Yeah.
You know, James, one thing that I thought was interesting today during forum that was, I found somewhat applicable to Quakerism 101 because of the content of the chapter, was when Paul asked, when you asked, I think you asked about growing the community and how they were able to grow the community in Colombia and what lessons we might learn as a meeting. And it struck me that in the very first of the two chapters, he talked about prophesizing and how as Quakers, that's, prophesizing is not typical, I'll say, or is more I'm not sure of the right words, but it says it talked about that a little bit. And there's a balance there between growing the community and being open and vocal about your seeking or your faith or your spirituality. That I find sometimes difficult. In other words, I have some young friends who I would love to come to meetings, and I'll invite them, but then, where do they, you're talking about religion or you're talking about church. And anyway, it's a balance.
Yeah, I guess we're still giving people a minute to come back. I know we have some people who are off, so we're not officially started back, but I guess, until I feel like I often have that sort of awkwardness too. Since I get very excited about all this, and I really like the Quaker meeting and stuff, and then it's like, well, so how does that fit into the rest of my, like, can I talk about this the rest of my life? Or what is the social etiquette? Am I being too pushy? Am I being like over? Yeah, I want to respect people's boundaries and not be coercive, or to not use my social relations in a way that seems exploitative. But I also think this is really cool, and I want people to know about it. So I don't know, it's a hard, I'm never quite sure how to navigate that.
Well, it looks like we're all back. One of the reasons I wanted to flip the script and look at bearing witness after changing things is because, at least in part, I think it's important to not leave here today thinking, okay, Quakers are doing a lot of good work in the world. Let's go home. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we consider the testimonies that are called out in the Bearing Witness chapter, so that when we leave here today, we think about those things that are at the root of motivating us to make positive change in the world. So Rex Ambler talks about equality, simplicity, honesty, and peace. He refers to Hugh Barber as being the source for. Oops, I see oh, Thanks, Edward. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Yeah, welcome.
So the equality is a really powerful testimony in Quakerism. And one of the things that I like the most about it is that it calls on us each to seek the truth for ourselves. And so this idea that there is that of God in every person has obviously profound implications, but also maybe this is an aside, but I actually feel like worship and ministry of Friends Meeting of Austin has their work cut out for them, because it's often a very quiet meeting. We don't hear from each other nearly as much as I'd like to. One of the things that surprised me when I started coming to Friends Meeting of Austin was how open I found myself becoming to what I'd call God talk. I'm an agnostic on my better days, and sometimes overly Christian or biblically oriented talk is off-putting to me. It's just something about myself that I'm actually getting over, which is nice. It took me a while to figure out that in fact, hearing testimony from others, not just even when, but perhaps especially when it was sort of rooted in scripture, was moving to me in ways I did not expect. And I guess I bring that up because we're all ministering to each other, and we're all in a position to learn from each other, and so it's entirely volunteer led. There's no pastor, there's no priest, no minister, and yet the ministry that I hear from the friends around us can be extraordinarily moving. And so what I say, worship and ministry has their work cut out for them, because I think it would be nice if more people spoke up. Yeah. But what do other people feel about equality? I mean, part of what it means to me is this sense of I am by no means the smartest person in the room. I need to hear from other people. Obviously, I can chatter on for a while, but in fact, I grew up in a Quaker meeting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where a lot of people talked a lot of the time, and a lot of what I heard was kind of ranting about the government or angry kind of rhetoric about problems in the world, and that's not what's going on in Friends Meeting of Austin. It seems a whole lot more spirit-led to me. Anyway, I'm gonna keep quiet for a minute and see if anyone else has anything to say about equality.
You mean hear from more people in meeting for worship?
No, I mean right now. But yes, also that.
I assume.
Yeah.
I assume he means equity also, right?
Yeah.
not just equality. I mean, I did highlight that section because that section, when I read it, was very powerful to me. I guess that's what drew my father to the Friends meeting way back in the early 1980s. So I didn't understand any of that back then, but as a kid, but I understand it now. So that's a very powerful statement. That whole section that Rex Ambler writes about equality and equity and peace is very powerful.
I appreciate that the section ends with the word solidarity. Yeah. But what it also says to me is that the combination of the two, the equality and that of God in every person, says to me that we're all spiritual leaders and we all have gifts to share.
Sometimes that testimony, it's difficult just if there really are sometimes people in our lives or that we see that really just seem relentlessly aggressive or unhelpful. And that sort of how to really still meet them and treat them as equals, and equal, if someone of equal worth and value. That is tricky.
We've got someone trying to get in. It's just here, I think. The other thing about that makes me think of is something that Walter Long said at the last Quakerism 101 on this topic. He said people prefer a good story to the truth, and so some of those who we're having trouble reaching, the aggressive folks, the folks who seem so unreachable. Yeah, that's that may be what's going on. And that's also where simplicity comes in, because it seems like I mean, a lot of what Rex Ambler talks about here in relating to simplicity is sort of letting go of possessions and that sort of thing. But sorry, someone want to share out loud what was in the chat? I didn't see it. Went by too quick.
Sure. Edward said, when I think of equality, I think about it in terms of simplicity of words and actions towards others. If a person keeps themselves humble in their actions and words towards others, there will be there will be greater equality and less individualistic egoism.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Edward, and thanks for reading it. Yeah. Yeah, this is a testimony that when Quakerism started out had a lot to do with plainness of speech and dress and the way people communicated with each other. It has a slightly different manner, meaning these days, I think, but part of it, yes, is related to simplicity of speech and action. If we cut away the the extraneous, get down to root causes, and these kind of testimonies, the actions that we take might be that much more effective in the world.
Yeah, I don't know if it was in this section, but there was another section he talks about taking what you need, only what you need, not what you want. And then darkness, he defines darkness. Darkness as being the state at which you are disconnected from each other as well as your physical environment, your ecosystem. That is the darkness, because we lose the bonds, the social bonds, as well as the bond to nature. So if we reconnect with those things, the natural bonds as well as bonds with other people, then we let the light shine through, I think is what I took away. And I think that's very important, because many of the problems that we face today are a result of, kind of unbridled or unrestrained consumerism, if you want to call it that. But yeah, it's very destructive. It can be.
Thanks for that, Prakash. You're reminding me of some things which I read in college. I read a book called I and Thou by a philosopher, a German Jewish philosopher named Martin Buber, who said that none of us are truly human unless we treat other people as humans rather than as objects. I will never be an I unless I treat you all as thou. That's the sort of the poetic way he uses of putting it. And there's a Christian philosopher named Paul Tillich who felt expressed some of the same views, which is that I'm going to get the quote from Jesus wrong, but wherever two or more of you are gathered together, there I am. And the idea is that it's only between people that divinity or holiness can be fully expressed. It's not so much with Paul Tillich's, like, it's not that there's a holy person, it's that it's the ways in which they interact with others that is the measure. Anyway, so yeah.
That kind of speaks to me, Jim, from some of the things that I've been watching, reading recently, that, in the world, in society today, it feels like our standard operating procedure, and I'm saying this very generalized, is to determine who the others are, who are the others. Once we're able to define that, then life becomes more simple, it seems like. And that's, to me, is where the I-thou concept, equality, and even the simplicity testimonies, they kind of come together there, because the simplicity is out of, as I understand the history, at least partially, it was out of treating each person the same. Thee and thou, those words were used to treat people, everybody, the same, whether it was royalty or not. And somehow this idea of others has become pretty important to me, and in order, I find, in order to really understand it better, I have to be self-critical and honest with myself, and sometimes that might even look like what was my first reaction when I met this person? Is that right? Did I come from a position of love when I met this person or during an interaction? You know, it requires some work on my part in order to eliminate this concept of others that somehow, you know, I think somehow in society, it's the way that we tend to migrate. And that's something we've got, that I feel that it's important for me to be self-exploratory and very honest with myself about what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and then determine where is that coming from.
Yeah, thanks, Chip. And I think I've heard you describe the ways various conversations go that you have with friends of yours who maybe are on the different end of the political spectrum or have completely different views. And we've had a forum about braver angels here. I think I missed it, but this is something that we're all kind of direly in need of in this country right now, is a vocabulary or a way to communicate with those who we disagree with.
Gosh, something, yeah, you were talking, Prakash, about that sort of idea of darkness and sort of separation. I guess this is one reason why in the sort of little break we were talking about the sort of ambivalent to not approving idea of proselytizing in Quakerism, but I guess one of the reasons I struggle with that is I feel like there is so much of that sort of darkness of intense isolation and disconnect and sort of focus on these like phones and sort of artificial relationships, and it just leaves people so vulnerable to all sorts of other nefarious kind of influences and really dark communities. And I feel like the sort of actual real communities and real sort of light of personal interaction and being with other people is so important. And that's why I just want Quakerism to just go everywhere and be all over the place, because I really think it's like this sort of being community and actually talking to people and actually trying to listen to each other and be in a space and be open. I feel is so vital. So I don't know, I have this deep desire to, just help tell people about this. This is great. There must be, I'm sure there are lots and lots of other ways that people are and do form real and good relationships that help build the world and let that light in. But I want to see this one grow.
Yeah. So honesty is the next testimony, and it's trickier maybe then than now, because I mean, Quakers were thrown in jail for speaking their truth. We're not at risk of that, but one of the things that Rex Ambler he sort of skates the line between expressing our truths and not proselytizing, I mean, he ends by calling it integrity, and this idea of being true to oneself is sort of a natural kind of outgrowth of this idea that there's that of God within you. There's a spiritual truth that's accessible to you, that you can listen to, pay attention to through silent worship. But it can't be something that is just like atomistic, I guess you might say. It's not true unless it's somehow shared. Is that fair to say about what Rex Ambler's getting at? Oh, atomistic is like an atom that is separated from another, like silos. People use the word silos, but we're all isolated in front of our computer screens or in front of our phones. So I kind of feel like honesty, it says honesty is an obvious expression of truth. It implies that we face the truth in ourselves and express that truth in our communication with others. And so it's not always easy to be certain that the truth that you've landed on is the truth. Partly because, as Rex says, circumstances change, our responses to them change as well. And I wonder sometimes about just how much easier it would be if there was a creed or doctrine that we could just sort of checklist. Yep, okay. It doesn't work that way.
I feel like that's one of the reasons I hadn't, even though it would be, I feel like, simpler and somehow satisfying to know I had something sort of concrete there of a doctrine or belief that I could, like, yep, that's it, and that's what I'm going to defend, and there. But I guess for me, that feels not truthful to myself, that I don't know that, whatever that doctrine is, and just being honest about what I don't know is sometimes the best thing, it seems.
Yeah, I had an experience once when I was in my early 20s. I lived in the same dorm as a fundamentalist Christian who was a friend of mine, and he was really working on me. And he finally said, "Look, if you just come to a service with me, and if that, then I'll stop bothering you." So I went to a service with him, and was there was a moment during the service when people were called to the front to receive the blessings of the Holy Spirit and receive Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, and I didn't go up, and I just felt at the time that it was a door closing rather than a door opening, or a division rather than a coming together, or I mean, I felt a little, I felt grief, sense of loss, but it wasn't the grief of turning away from God or turning away from spirituality in my mind at that point. And I still feel this way, but a grief of that it's not possible in some communities to come together in loving kind of wholeness and togetherness without that, creed or doctrine. And, you know, I think that was probably part of the earliest time for me where I decided I was getting a little sick of God talk. I'm really happy here, you know, decades later, to be kind of coming around the bend and kind of closing the circle off and hearing testimony from about the Bible from Quakers, and it's reaching me. So something about the honesty of the delivery, that it comes from a person's own heart and truth and inner light, rather than filtered through a doctrine or checklist. And I don't mean to minimize the experience of other faith communities. It's just not for me. It's not an honest expression of my own faith. So that was a difficult day, a difficult Sunday.
Did you talk to him?
I did talk to him about it, and I shared, you know, that I felt really kind of sad that they kind of closed off this, because it was a fairly ecstatic kind of service. I think there might have been speaking in tongues, but a lot of joyous outpouring of faith. And anyway, so this question about honesty is an important.
When you said there's no checklist, are you talking about no checklist per se for Quakerism or something else?
Yeah, that's sort of what
I didn't understand.
Yeah, so
I didn't understand because. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's this idea that there's steps that are required and necessary in order that are tied to creed or doctrine, that are necessary in order to move forward in one's spiritual journey. Like you have to believe X, Y, and Z, and then you can move forward in your spiritual journey.
Okay, so this is important for me to understand, maybe others too, but there is a framework for being a Quaker, right? Like I can't be a totally violent person, solve all my problems with violence, and then say I'm a Quaker, right? That doesn't, so there's a general framework, right? I mean, we can all agree that there's a framework. Okay.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just checking.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to the way we started this whole conversation, which is the idea of love, and that's kind of maybe the firmest foundation of all in Quakerism.
Did you have a question?
Well, yeah, it's kind of going back to something else, but you were saying that you know, they were inviting people to come up if they felt the spirit of the Lord and all that. But I kind of wonder whether they're saying one thing really meaning another. That they're saying, you know, if you come up here, it's because we've convinced you to think the way we think, and that would make, you know, it's.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really interested in how to talk about Quakerism without proselytizing, and it's why I really like the use of the word experiment, because these ideas and concepts aren't fully true to any of us until they've been kind of tested, and that's not just testing in your own heart, but also in a larger community. And so that's that's a beautiful celebration of diversity in my mind. The idea that we all have something, it's different, but it's still true.
I wonder, that might be a nice partial question or answer to what Prakash was asking about, that sort of what is the boundary, or where is the line?
Yeah.
I feel like that's also been sort of a constant subject to experimentation throughout Quaker history, is what is the sort of balance of acceptable behavior within the community. And at times it's been, I think, overly restrictive. We talked a little bit about the sort of quietist period where people really did just say thee and thou and have to wear, gray and only marry within the Quaker community, and that might have been, even if not based on an explicit creed, there were very, very clear boundaries on acceptable behavior. And nowadays I feel like our experiments with the Spirit has led us to a much more expansive sort of set to where it's, I guess if people were being really deliberately harmful and malicious to one another, or deceitful, or trying to, then I could see that being sort of outside of the boundaries of what people would. Thankfully, I don't, at least to my knowledge, that doesn't really happen too much. That it is also sort of a matter of constant discernment and experimentation. What is, where that limit is.
I think this might relate a little bit to what we were just talking about, but Edward had a question. If you would, could you elaborate a little on the framework? This has been one of my deepest reservations about Quakerism and why I'm still just trying to learn more. And this popped up during the conversation about creeds, lack of checklists, and that sort of foundation of love concept.
Yeah, I mean, Quakerism 101 is a great way of exploring all of that. There's the videos on the website are worth exploring in answer to some of these questions. But my elevator speech version is something like every human being, and if you want to be more expansive about it, you could say every living creature has a spark of divinity within it, each of us. And that's a source of truth and knowledge if we quiet the mind and seek the wisdom within. The trick is that we're doing that in fellowship and in community with each other. And we are remaining open, not just to our own truths, but the truths of each other. So you don't necessarily need a Bible, the book, you don't necessarily need a priest, you don't necessarily need a church. But what you do need are other folks seeking the truth, who are willing to come together in silent meditation and worship. And I guess I'll leave it there. But other people should try and answer this question too, because it's a good one. What is the framework?
Well, I'll take a go. Even though I have not been a member that long, but to me, maybe if the question were what attracted me to Quakerism, maybe that would be easier for me to answer than to talk about creed. But I will say the fact that I know within the Friends meeting of Austin, I know that there are people who were brought up in a Jewish heritage, a Christian heritage. Some are fundamental Christian heritage. Some, like me, were pretty much, parents didn't really ever go to church much. And there's a wide variety of that. And that's one of the attractions to me. And going along with that is the attraction that I think that the idea of, and I'll use the priesthood of all believers, or that of God in each of us, kind of hand in hand. But I think like Jim was saying, the acceptance of each other's, that each other's pathway, spiritual pathway, is likely different. Not that it may be different, it likely is different. If we believe that there's that of God in each of us, and that we can listen to that. And so it's to me, the attraction, that was part of the attraction, was the fact that I knew that, or I know that there were so many diverse backgrounds, and that added to the experience. And then just one other quick thought on the community aspect of it. I find that oftentimes the vocal ministry may speak very directly to me, may feel very, how did this happen that I just heard this? It was what I needed that particular day. And sometimes it doesn't always do that. But I think that when we worship in the community sense like that, that's what makes that prone to happen. And it doesn't have to happen in any specific way. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. And I'm sorry, let me say one more thing quick, because I'm going to have to run to go pick up my wife at the airport. But Jim, did you mention that Peace and Social Concerns is this Friday evening already?
Yes, that's right. No, I didn't, but thank you. Open meeting, everyone's invited.
Yeah. And y'all take care.
Thanks, Chip. I just realized we've gone over.
Oh,
Does this go until we haven't?
Yeah. So we started a half hour later.
Oh, thank you.
So yes.
Right.
So we're still good.
So we're still
As long as
good.
everybody's,
Yeah.
Understand if anyone needs to go, but yes.
Yeah.
We're still good for about
Yeah.
15 more minutes. Yeah.
So, but go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering, Heath, it sounded like you were about to say something.
Oh yeah, I was just going to throw out that I think along with what everybody's been sharing about sort of the experience of inward light and all of that is, when I think about Quakerism as a path compared to other religions, and especially maybe other forms of more mainline Christianity, is that we don't take a sacred text as being sort of the end of the story. Like with Quakerism kind of coming out of Christianity originally, it's not like the Bible is a complete story. That's all that has ever been revealed. That may be divinely inspired, but that same presence or that same experience is still immediately accessible, and it's still an ongoing sort of revelation. I think that's something that Quakers across the spectrum generally seem to have in common, is that sort of an idea of continuing revelation.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last testimony that Rex shares is the peace testimony, Quakerism has been a pacifist religion since the earliest days. Well, maybe not since the earliest days, but yeah, it's the apology to Charles is
Declaration
to Charles, yeah, in 1640s or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's so central. I mean, like love, it might be as central a doctrine as any others. I don't know that it would be possible to be a violent, aggressive Quaker. I'm sure there have been.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, and it's one honestly we had. Speaking of interesting videos, if you're curious about sort of, we talked about this a little bit in relation to the war in Ukraine at a forum recently. And something really to wrestle with since, and this is something Quakers have wrestled with historically, is just sometimes the justifications for war feel very, very compelling. And some really notable cases, the Civil War A lot of friends felt called to serve on the side of the Union in that, just because of the evil of the institution of slavery and that sort of abolitionist cause. And that was a real difficulty for the friends. How did they react to that? And my understanding is, and probably this varied from meeting to meeting, but that it was accepted that some people did feel called to serve in the military during the Civil War, and that they were, for the most part, welcomed back into the meetings after they had served, and that was a similar, I think, situation in World War II, when people in World War I, there were definitely friends who were conscientious objectors and tried to be involved in other ways in those conflicts. After World War II, Friends Service Committee, which we talked about, won the Nobel Peace Prize for its work trying to provide relief in Germany and really the devastated areas. But other friends probably did serve in the military there as well. There really was a deep, yeah, so, but then I think there is deep down the sense that if all human life is equal and every life is valuable, then taking life just, it can never really sit easily with that view. And it's, I don't think that ends the conversation. That there are times like the Civil War, like World War II, where you have these sort of conflicts that really pull at other deep moral commitments that friends have. And I think some people felt that way too, like what's happening in Ukraine, like this is clearly a deep act of aggression and evil that's being perpetrated on this country. And I would never condemn the people in Ukraine for defending themselves. That's not, so, I'm not sure that's not really a concrete answer, but it's more just the difficulty of this testimony, I think, is, and that it's, where I come down myself is just the necessity of working for peace before we even ever get to that point of that disaster and that war, of trying to sow the seeds of peace and get rid of the seeds of war whenever we can, and to try to be not just pacifist when the war starts, but like to start now, basically, in trying to stop it from happening ever.
Yeah, there's sorry, I missed that forum. I'm gonna go watch it. Yeah. But the phrase that I liked from the minute that the Friends meeting of Austin passed on the Ukraine crisis was courageous peacemaking. And this idea that it takes a lot of courage. It's really hard to engage in peacemaking, because you make peace not with your friends, but with your enemies. Yeah.
Yeah, the part where you said, James and Jim, about working towards peace before the violence happens, that resonated with me, because there's a part in the book that talks about the Friends and the Quakers having an office at the UN, United Nations, where delegates, from Palestine or Israel or Nigeria, and during the Nigerian Civil War in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, where they could talk about really what was bothering, both sides, without the cameras, without the politicians. That's bearing witness to the truth without spectacle. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
There are, Friends peace teams all over the world. It's I'm not sure what the organization is. I get just Friends Peace Team.
I think that's
it's what it's called. Friends Peace Teams. Yeah, and they operate all over, just training people and going and trying to just
nonviolent resistance,
and to sort of help help facilitate those conversations before things get to a point of violence.
There's a program called Alternatives to Violence, which some members of the Friends Meeting of Austin have in the past provided training on in prisons as well. So Liz Yates and Glenna Balch have gone into the Bastrop Men's Prison to provide training in a nonviolent conflict resolution program called Alternatives to Violence.
Yeah. Yeah, she mentioned that because our son, I think, tried to. But there is a cautionary tale, though, because after the violence begins, the side, usually in asymmetrical warfare, the side that's usually the downtrodden side, can justify their violence by saying, that they're the victims. So after 9/11 happened, many people who may have been indirectly or directly involved in that attack, they were justifying that violence because of US and Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and because of American involvement in Saudi Arabia and in Palestine. They said, we're the downtrodden, so we are using violence towards a major colonial power who we see as a threat. Because I'm not saying me, I'm just quoting what some of the people used to say, my friend's son's wedding was blown up in Pakistan because of US-made bombs and drones. So that they're killing my innocence, so I'm going to kill their innocence, like that.
Yeah.
So that's a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to talk about the peace testimony without acknowledging that the US military is funded better than all the others in the world combined. Or am I exaggerating? If I'm exaggerating, maybe just by a little bit. Yeah. Part of what we need to do is dismantle the war machine at home in this country. It's hard. The Ukraine is a really hard example. I've seen really heartfelt and cogent arguments that the US is using this as a proxy war to weaken the Soviet army at the expense of the Ukrainian people, and will do whatever it can to keep the war going as long as possible in order to further weaken the Russians. There's a lot of cynical and perhaps not entirely untrue reporting out there criticizing the US and NATO involvement. And what that all says to me is that I would do better speaking to people of faith about this situation, rather than people with geopolitical knowledge or aspirations. So I'm going to follow the link. Erica gave a special shout out today at Rise Up Meeting that there's a link in the weekly bulletin to some work that Quakers are doing in Europe on behalf of Ukraine. So I'd really like to learn more about that. There's so many. Well, yeah. The other thing, which is such a truism, is that if you want peace, you need to work for justice.
Just got a few minutes left.
A couple minutes left.
Yeah.
I really appreciate James, you asking me to lead this session, and for everyone's willingness to kind of feel our way collectively through Rex Ambler's book. I co-clerk the Peace and Social Concerns Committee with Chip. It's a role I kind of fell into when the previous clerk moved to Columbia. I don't consider myself an expert in any of this at all, so I was really grateful to have the book that we could read together, and glad to be speaking with you all, to hearing your truths as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for leading this discussion today, Jim.
Yeah, thank you.
And to everyone, stay tuned for the date of the final session of Quakerism 101, which had to be postponed. I think, Julian may have had a reaction to a COVID shot, or it was, we need to postpone that one. I guess I'll just go ahead and
Sign off.
yeah.
Good to see you all.